Greetings, I am Magwood of Uprooting Inequity, and this is a very tiny snippet of my series on a history of anti-Black structural racism. So the series consists of 4 seminars which build on each other both chronologically and conceptually. We can think of structural racism as essentially group level inequalities in access to opportunity. So let's say the branches of the tree represent outcomes, for example, income levels or college attainment rates. And these are obviously partially a product of our individual merit, effort, and skills. But they're also a product of access to opportunity, right? So it is that access to education and healthcare and job networks that allows us to realize our potential, to realize that those skills, right? But the problem is that in some neighborhoods, we have very unequal access to opportunity. So in high poverty neighborhoods, particularly those disproportionately majority minority, there is significantly less access to opportunity. And what I break down in my seminars is that that those are rooted in the legacies of historical discrimination. So it is these are the roots of historical discrimination are essentially what is structural racism. So the legacies of racial discrimination, which I show in my seminars, were not remediated by civil rights legislation. One of the products is, of course, anti-Black bias and racial stigma. That's what we see today. But the other persistent legacies are the racial wealth gap and residential segregation, which are the roots of structural racism today. So just a very quick overview of some of these parts of historical discrimination that affect today's racial wealth gap. Going back through history, again, these are just some highlights. The monetary value of slavery is estimated, depending on the study, in current currency between $14 billion to $10.7 trillion. So that money didn't just disappear in history, right? It was invested and passed down through generations, and it still existed as in the wealth of some families today. And of course, formerly enslaved persons never received any compensation or reparations. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres of land, free land, to 1.6 million white citizens that we stole from indigenous people. Less than 6,000 Black families benefited. New Deal minimum wage and overtime laws and Social Security program transformed the lives of white workers and the elderly. Southern congressmen refused to sign the laws until they were intentionally excluded job categories that most Black people had at the time: domestic labor, agricultural labor, also food service. The Wagner protected union collective bargaining, greatly increasing the security and wages of blue-collar workers. Blacks were excluded from unions formally until the 1960s, but in practice through the 1970s and 80s. The GI Bill spent the equivalent of, in current currency, $119 billion to pay for college tuition to 2.2 million veterans, training to 5.6 million veterans, and unemployment benefits to nearly 9 million veterans. Very few Black veterans benefited. Same thing, because Southern congressmen insisted on local implementation, local control instead of federal control. And so most Black veterans in the South did not benefit from the GI Bill, and most Black veterans at the time were in the South. The FHA and the VA spent the equivalent of $1 trillion on highly subsidized mortgage loans, creating almost whole cloth a new white middle class, while Hoke spent the equivalent of $2 billion on refinancing. Less than 2% of these subsidized mortgages went to all non-whites combined. Meanwhile, the federal government imposed racial segregation and redlined Black neighborhoods. Professor Ira Katznelson refers to this as white affirmative action. And economists believe that these virtually white-only public investments, namely the GI Bill and FHA and VA-backed mortgages, are largely responsible for the dramatic expansion of the middle class between 1940 and 1970. So this is the economic status of the US population between 1940 and 1996. And we can see that in 1940, only 10% of the population was middle class. Vast majority were poor. Now, this would have declined somewhat since 1930 because of the Great Depression. However, didn't decline that much. A large middle class is largely a modern phenomenon. But look at the dramatic increase in the middle class from 10% in 1940 to 50% in 1970 in just 3 decades. And this was, as economists say, due primarily to these white-only investments, which means that this middle class was primarily white. And you can see that it hasn't changed much. The size of the middle class hasn't changed much since then, meaning after these subsidies were over and after African Americans were eligible. And civil rights legislation did not end racism for several reasons, but one of them that I explore is that civil rights legislation only outlawed future discrimination. They didn't repair the accumulated gains of past discrimination, which continue to impact the present through the racial wealth gap and residential segregation. So this permits historical discrimination and segregation to be perpetuated and reproduced in so-called race-neutral or colorblind policies and practices, with wealth and geography acting as proxies for race. So I'm going to give you 2 examples. Example 1 is education. Our colorblind school funding system perpetuates our historical separate and unequal school system, with geography and the racial wealth gap acting as proxies for race. So let me break down how that happens. So on average, 44% of public school funding comes from local property taxes. So this differs from most other countries where the federal government is funding all public schools equally, of course, adjusting for local cost of living. So here we have the average revenue funding per student, and you can see how much it differs by both income level and race, because areas that neighborhoods that are wealthy have higher levels of property taxes and higher levels of public school funding, which translates usually into differences in quality of education. So that's important, because that means that racial disparities persist not just in outcomes, but also in access to opportunity. All children don't have equal access to opportunity in the United States, not even to education, which is the biggest potential engine of economic mobility. So the average non-white school district receives $2,226 per student less than a white district. That adds up over time. And on average, high poverty white school districts receive more funding per student than low poverty non-white districts. So that means there's a separate income and racial effect. My second example is housing segregation. So colorblind economic exclusionary zoning policies perpetuate historical segregation, with the racial wealth gap acting as a proxy for race. So economic exclusionary zoning is zoning for single family homes only. So it's usually wealthier people who can afford that. And so in these maps, the pink areas are zoned for detached single family homes only. And exclusionary zoning it's important to know, that was intentionally designed to get around the Buchanan, the Supreme Court case that declared that racial zoning was unconstitutional. So they intentionally figured out that we can say, instead of saying white only, we can say detached single family homes only, which only the wealthier can afford, which are disproportionately white because of that racial wealth gap. And so, for example, we can see very strong correlation between historical discrimination and today's economic exclusionary zoning. So, for example, this is Cleveland, Ohio. Here's a whole redlining map from 1939. The red areas indicate areas where lending was discouraged because so supposedly it would be a high risk. And so I'm going to circle the areas that are redlined. And then here is a map of Cleveland today. And this is the yellow areas indicate areas that are covered by exclusionary zoning. So now I'm going to copy paste and superimpose those redlining circles on the map. And you can see that there's a very strong correlation between that historical discrimination and the so-called colorblind economic zoning today. And again, it's not a surprise, since it was intentionally designed. But technically it is, it's colorblind and race neutral. And so that's how this is just a taste of how the legacies of historical discrimination end up result in high poverty areas that are disproportionately African American, where there's unequal access to high quality education, et cetera. And this results in very place-based, since this historical discrimination was very place-based, as we saw, then that means that structural racism is also very place-based, that access to opportunity is very place-based. And that translates into upward mobility rates, the American dream, also being very place-based. So for example, these are Black upward mobility rates for African Americans in Wake County, North Carolina. It's just arbitrary, I just picked a place, and you can see how much upward mobility for African Americans differs by place. Thank you very much.